I Friday night at least, I do not like going out. You know what I
Mm.
mean? I like just to like dive in, just start shopping immediately, and you know, just immediately, and then be able to just learn and pass out. You know what I mean? And then
Yep.
you get to wake up early and get some like chatzos learning in, and then you figure out from there. But anyways, but yeah, no, I feel you on that. All right, so let's go into we got a lot of work to do today. Okay. All right, so we're in Mesillat Yasharim, the Ramchal's World Safer Path of the Just. Okay, so I was looking at it a little bit. Okay, so we're in chapter 5, yeah, and it's always just to connect because we have like certain gaps. We're just gonna just look at a little bit of the chapter before. Okay, okay. So he ends like this. Okay, he says this is the last part just to connect it. He says Nimsa she'in le'adam harotze leaf kocha. So he said so we find therefore that a man who wants to open his eyes does not have any valid enticements to prevent him from being watchful of his deeds to the utmost in watchfulness, and to examine them with the utmost scrutiny. And indeed, all of these investigations, of which one considers, certainly acquires them through the trait of watchfulness. If he is a, you know, whatever, conscientious person, whatever. Okay, so he's talking about this idea of, being able to reflect back and look at, our day, right? Look at our day, think about our mornings, our afternoons, think about our conversations, how we interacted with people, what our intentions were behind our words, these types of things. We should be aware of them and we should think about them. And that's the basis of chapter 4. So now we're over here. And so it says, Beveroda mefasi de hazi hazihi roots. So he says like this: there are three factors which causes loss of density, cause loss of and distances from watchfulness. So this idea of watchfulness, something that we want to cling to think about and reflect upon to strengthen ourselves in our closeness to God. He said there's three mechanisms that separate us from this watchfulness. He says, tipul ha tirda maha ole meet. Right. So he said the first involvement, and first is the involvement. So this is the first one: the involvement in preoccupation in worldly affairs. So he's saying that the person who's very preoccupied with worldly affairs, like what's going on here, who's inauguration, who just won the Oscars, won the Emmy, who has this new single came out, who just scored 30 points, all this stuff is worldly affairs. And this is leads to separation from being watchful of one's actions. The second thing is laughter and levity. So like just like silliness, like just some people they just look at TikTok and these silly videos and just mindless type of stuff. And the third thing is bad company. And he says we will discuss them each one in turn. Hine ha tipul veha tarda kaver devaranu mehem le ma'ala. So he says, regarding the worldly involvement and preoccupation, we have spoken about this earlier. For while a man is occupied in worldly affairs, his thoughts are bound by the chain of the burden that weighs on them. and it is impossible for him to give thought to his deeds. And he says, Ve'hachamim alechem v'hashalom. He says, consider this, the sages, peace be upon them, said, minimize your worldly occupations and toil in the Torah. It says in Pri Avot, Ki hine ha'asek mukra hu ha'adam sarech. He says, occupying oneself to obtain a livelihood is indeed necessary, but it is not necessary to occupy oneself to such an extent that he has left no room for the service of God. For this, we would command to a fixed times for Torah study. Ukavar v'zicharenu she'i ha mitztare cheta yoter mile adam. He says, we have already pointed out that this is the most essential of all things for the acquiring of watchfulness. As the Brisa of Rabbi Pinchas ben Ezir states, the Torah brings watchfulness, but without Torah, one will not reach it at all. He says, this is what our sages say, an arrogant man cannot be pious. Veze ki ha bore yitvarech shemo shebara hayatzar. And he says for the Creator, blessed be He, who created the evil inclination, also created the Torah as a antidote. As our sages in Blessed Memory stated, I have created the evil incarnation, and I have created the Torah as its antidote. Says in Kedushin. Vehine pasuthu she'ima haborelo bara. So he says, behold, it is obvious that if the Creator created for his affliction only this remedy, then it would be impossible under any circumstances for a man to heal himself from this affliction without employing treatment. One who thinks to save himself without Torah study is only mistaken and will see his errors only in the end when he dies in sin. Ki hine hayatzar hara be'emed chazak hu ha'adam meod. For in truth, the evil inclination is exceedingly powerful on a man. Without a man's knowledge, it advances and strengthens over him and becomes rule over him. And if he employs all of the strategies in the world, but does not take on the medication created for it, namely the Torah, as I wrote, he will not nor feel the intensification of his illness until he dies in sin, and his soul will be lost. And you know what? Unfortunately, I know a lot of people making some, not a lot. I know a few guys that are not living in the right way, and it's just a very important thing, just to be aware of. Like, we don't even know if the evil inclination is taking us over. You know what I'm saying? Like you know what I mean? Like, it's like you don't even know. Like, you think you're like holy, you think you're a big rabbi or a big teacher or a big business person, and you're like the biggest Rasha, and you have no idea, right? Because you have not used the Torah as a mechanism to, one, understand where you're holding at, and also how to fix it. He says, "Halamaze dome." He says, "And to what can it be likened? To the case of a sick person who consults the doctor. They recognize his illness and prescribe him a healing medication, but he, without any prior knowledge of medicine, disregards the medicine and instead takes whatever medicine that occurs to him. Will not this sick person certainly die?" So he's just an example. He's like, the doctor gives you medication. You're like, I don't want this medication. I want my own medication. He said, what do you think's going to happen to this person? He says, Ken hadever hazeh. So he says, and so too in our case, No one recognizes the illness of the evil inclination and its power except for the Creator who created it. And himself cautions us that only the remedy for it is Torah, who then will abandon it, take something else instead, and expect to live. How are you going to live without the Torah? Certainly, the darkness of the physical will advance and strengthen over him level after level without his realizing it until he finds himself immersed in evil, so distant and far from the truth that even thought of seeking truth will not enter his heart. So the fools are so dark. It's not. It doesn't even. That's a scary place, man. Like to be in a place where you just like you can't even think of holiness and tshuva. Like you're so consumed by darkness. Ach im hu osech beTorah bara oto devaracheha. So he says, but if he toils in the Torah, and when he sees its ways, his commandments and warnings, and beholds on its own, certainly a renewal will awaken within him, which will bring him to the good path. This is what our sages of blessed memory have stated. What that the sages have stated. Would that it were that they abandoned me but kept my Torah, for the light within it would bring them back to good. So this is an echad, Rabbah. והנה בכלל הזה גם כן קביעות העתים. So he says, include in this also a fixed daily time for accounting of one's deeds and their corrections, as mentioned earlier. וממלבד כל זה מה שישאר לו פנאי מעשה חוואים חכם. Sorry about that. Anyways, all right. So he says, besides all of this, all of the free time has left from his affairs. If he is wise, certainly he should not waste it, but rather immediately grabs a hold of it and not be lax in it. Utilize it to toil in the affairs of his soul and improve the service of God. Veze hama seed af al pi shehu ha-yoter kalali hinehu ha-yoter kal le me. So he says, although this detrimental factor we have discussed is most prevalent, nevertheless, it is easiest to escape from it for he who wants to escape it. So okay, we give you the things, but that's it. So he's saying idle idle stuff, still like these this idea of being in worldly affairs, right? And his worldly affairs is being this huge detriment from us being able to focus on the Torah and to focus on this. And he gave us example. He said the detriment of not being in the Torah is that you cannot cure the purpose of your correction of your soul, right? Like we learned by Rav Ashlag that we're here. The Torah is here to correct our soul, because the only way we get to the next level is when the soul is totally corrected, and that gives us the ability to be resurrected with the dead. And then when we're resurrected with the dead, God will give us a new body. And then this new body, will be also in the frame of perfection, just like our soul, right? So he's saying if you are focused on world affairs, you can miss out on this whole opportunity. He says, ha sheni hinehu kashe me'od. The second detrimental factor, laughter and levity, is very severe. One who is immersed in these things is like one immersed in a great sea, from which he is extremely difficult to escape. For behold, laughter destroys a man's heart until reason and knowledge no longer rule him. He becomes like a drunkard. or a made man, whereby it is impossible to give counsel or to guide them, for they are incapable of accepting any direction. So this is the guy. This is the guy who everything's a joke. Nothing serious. Everything's a joke. You're going too serious. This type of a thing. This is what he's saying. So he's saying this is a very difficult thing to get out of because he said he compared it to a great river or a great sea that's hard to escape. So let's explore more. Vehuma she'amar she'lomo ha'melech alav ha'shalom. So and this is said by King David, peace be upon him. He says, I said of laughter, it is madness and of merriment. What use of it? So again, he's not saying we shouldn't have joy, we shouldn't have, be besimcha, we shouldn't be. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about silliness, right? We're talking about a frame of non severity of looking at life and not taking anything serious, and people trying to give you good advice, but everything's a joke and everything's very light, right? So he's saying by this, hold on, I'm just getting some carbonated that carbonated soda stuff is like really good. Okay, all right. So he's asking, King Shlomo, he says this, right? So he says like this. So he says like this. He says for he says the sage of blessed memory says laughter and lightheartedness habituate habituate a person to illicit relations. So he said if you're in that goofy stuff, it can lead to like promiscuous stuff. Like if you're in the frame of reference where if you're in a frame of reference where you're in a frame of reference where you're just about silliness and goofiness, he said Galita. She says, for even though sexual immorality is regarded as severe by every man of faith, and his heart appears approaching it due to the vivid picture that has been imprinted in his mind of the enormity of the sin and the severe punishment it occurs. Nevertheless, laughter and lightheadedness draws him on on a little by a little, advancing him nearer till the fear of sin leaves him, bit by bit, degree by degree, until he reaches the sin itself and he commits it. So he's saying the silliness was just like, it may not, even though you may be even somewhat of a religious guy, right? He's saying, but if you look at the world in this silly way, you don't take things seriously, even things that are called, even the big averas, like he used a big one, right? Which is sexual morality, right? To be with a woman, who's impure, who's forbidden to you, right? He says it's a huge thing. So he says, big call, lema. He says, why is it so? Because just like the essence of watchfulness involves putting matters to mind, so the essence of laughter is so to remove one's mind straight rational thinking, so that the thoughts of fearing God do not enter his heart at all. Ve'tir koshi. He says, consider the severity of levity and its destruction power. It is like a shield smeared. It's like a shield smeared with oil defects, and drops arrows from him, causing him to fall to the ground, preventing him from reaching the body of the man. So too levity for before rebuke and reprimand. He says, one who acts with, I think we say levity is like, or laughter, like sarcasm. A man who casts himself a great many, you know, whatever rosings and impressions that the heart made, that, that the heart was made to feel due to to stimulation in seeing the hearing matters that awkward that awakened him to the account and examine of his deeds. So he's saying that like this is a sarcasm thing, right? Like if you're a sarcastic person, again, it's part of another aspect of not taking things seriously. And truthfully, you can see how they work together. You can see how being in worldly affairs to actually lead someone to um, to lead someone to it's like some people love comedy, and it's okay to love comedy. Comedy is cool, right? But the thing is saying that the issue by comedy is that like when that becomes your outlook on the world, and you see that, right? It's not gonna put you in a mindset of investigating yourself and looking at your deeds, right? How can you? So it's brilliant how he's saying it. ובכוחלה הליצנות יפיל הכל לארץ ולא יעשה בו רושם כלל. So he says the power of sarcasm knocks it all to the ground, thus not making any impression whatsoever on him. This is not due to the ineffectiveness of the matter or the lack of understanding on his part, but rather the power of sarcasm, which diminishes all matters of Musar, ethics, and the fear of God. Vehivne hanavi ya saya haya sovecha al ze. So he says, behold, behold, the prophet Isaiah would scream like a crane, for he saw that this was no room left for his rebuke to make an impression, thus ruining all hope for the sinner. Thus he said, and now do not be a mocker, less effective, less of he be less not be the mocker, less be your affliction, be strengthened. All right. I kind of like went through it. Okay, so he says like this. So Prophet Isaiah would scream like a crane. He saw this was a thing, and he would say, "And now, how do not be a mocker, lest your affliction become strengthened?" So Prophet Isaiah, he spoke on this point too. Hashem spoke through Prophet Isaiah for us to understand this idea of the sarcastic and having a sarcastic, having a silly mind. You know, and it's an interesting thing with that too because a lot of times, you know, um, you hear a lot about like guarding your eyes, right? Like a man guarding his eyes, not looking at other women, not looking at this. And you think about it like, somebody say, hey, you know what? God doesn't want us to look at other women because we should be focused on our woman, one, and two. And if we don't, we should look at it in a holy way, right? And that's definitely one way to look at it, right? One way to look at it is like, hey, let's not look at women in these sexual ways because I want to become aroused. I don't want to waste seed. I don't want to, be tempted to commit a sin, and all that's true. But the main thing around it is that when a guy is looking at a woman that's not his, he has no connection to, never has a chance to acquire her as a wife, nothing, not even meeting her. And he thinks about her sexually. He's training his mind to think in the frame of fantasy over and over again. Every time he looks at a girl, he imagines and he fantasizes. That's what he's training his makshava. He's changing his thoughts, his makshava. He's training it to think as a silly person, right? To think as a guy who's thinking in fantasy. And so when it comes to making real decisions in life, he can't differentiate between fantasy and reality. Right? Like, is this the right business opportunity? Is this the right place to move? Is this the right acquisition? Is this the right partnership? Is this the right person? Because you live in an idealistic stage. You're not in reality, right? And we're talking about the guy who does this. So he says, Uve, he says, Ukevar, Gazru Omer Chachamim Vezakoronam Livracha. So he says, in the sages of blessed memory have proclaimed, one who is given sarcasm brings affliction on himself. The scriptures state explicitly, judgments are prepared for the frivolous. And he says, and this is something. This is something. This is sometime reason dictates. For when one is aroused through reflection to study, does not need the ordeal of bodily suffering, since he will repent of his sins even without this. He will repent by the means of the thoughts of repentance, awakening his heart, stimulated by the reading and the hearing of the reprimands and rebukes. Al ha ha lesim ha enam mit pa'alim min ha tochachot. So he says, but the frivolous are not impacted by the rebukes due to the power of sarcasm. Therefore, there's no way to rectify them except through suffering. For there, for there is no, there is not, for they are not capable of deflecting the impact of suffering, though through the power of sarcasm, like they do so with rebuke. So he says those types of people. Hashem says, you know what? You don't want to hear it. Suffer, suffer. As we learned by Rav Ashlag that we learned by Rav Ashlag that the human being, right? The human being is has two ways to correct your soul because the soul is ultimately going to be perfected. One way is through Torah mitzvot, and another way is through suffering. But either way, it's going to happen. According vehine kp machomer hachet. So he says, according to the severity of the sin and its consequences, the true jug increases its punishment, as our sages and blessed Mary have taught us. Sarcasm extremely severe. It starts with suffering and ends with utter destruction, is written in Isaiah. And how do not be a mocker, lest lest your bond be strengthened. For the decree of destructions have I heard. Veha vehama vehama vehamafsid mahashelishi. So he says the third detrimental factor is company, namely the company of fools and sinners. He says this is what the scripture says: he who befriends the fool will be broken. We can see many times, even after the true of a man's duty for divine service and watchfulness of his has been established by him, he becomes lax in it or transgresses certain commandments, so that his friends do not mock him, or in order to be able to mingle freely in their company. Amen. They said you know what a person's future is by the five people they talk to the most, you know? And even on a material level, they show people the company you keep affects your bottom line tremendously. So it says, Vehu ma sheshalomo maha mazihir veve omer. So he says, this is the intent of Shlomo's warning. Do not mingle with those who make changes. What does that mean? Those who make changes. And it says in Proverbs, and obviously we know it's the first Psalms. The first Psalms talks about, in Tehillim talks about not being with wicked people. He says, if a man claims to you, a person's mind should always be associated with his fellow man. It says in Kitzur, it says, reply to him, this reference to the human being who acts like human beings, not human beings who act like animals. He says, so if a person brings a verse and says, no, you got to be with your fellow man. Shlomo clarifies and says, no, he's not talking about that. He's talking about people who act like Ben Adams, like holy people, right? He says, now human beings will act like animals. Shlomo warned us. He says, go from before the fools and men. Go from before a foolish man. Sorry. He says, and King David said, fortunate is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, stands in the way of the sinner, nor sits in the seat of the scoffer. Our sages expound this. If if he walks, he will stand. If he stood, he will eventually sit. I did not sit with the men of falsehood, neither did I go with hypocrites. I I have hated the congregation of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked, says in Psalms. Elo ha'adam ba'ele, a man has no remedy but to purify and cleanse himself and to refrain his feet from the ways of the masters who are sunken in the vanities of their time, and to redirect his feet of the courtyard of God in his sanctuary. And in that David himself concludes, I shall wish my hands in cleanliness, and I shall go around your altar. Ve'i ye ara lo sheyi say. He says, and if he begin to find himself in the company of those who mock him, he should not give his heart to mockery. On the contrary, let him mock them and shame them. Let him consider in his heart if he had an opportunity to profit a great amount of money, he would leave what he needed to do for for this for the due to help others. People's mocking. Wait, hold on. He says, on the contrary, let him mock them and shame them. So people make fun of you, make fun of them. Let him consider in his heart if he had an opportunity to profit a great amount of money, he would leave what he needed to do for his due to others mocking him. How much more so to not want to lose his soul for the sake of sparring himself with mockery? All right, I think yes. So it says, "Ve'al derek ze hazi iru zikaronam libracha." So he says, in this manner, the sage has a blessed memory warned us: be brazen as a leopard, and do the will of your Father in heaven. David said, I will speak for your testimony before the kings, and you will not be ashamed. He says, She'af al pi masherov ha'ma'a kalib. So he says, and he says, and if he says, and even though most kings' occupation speech is in a manner of grand accomplishment pleasures, and David, who was a king, would seem to be embarrassed to speak the words of the Torah and ethics while in their company instead of the great feats and pleasures like them. Nevertheless, he did not care at all. In his heart, he was not enticed for these vanities. After he already obtained the truth, rather he explicitly stated, I will speak of your testimony before the kings, and I will not be ashamed. Likewise, Isaiah said, I will set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall be not ashamed. Thoughts, reflections?
You know, I got a few. So like on that last part, you know, being able to speak Torah at all times. Like I remember when I first really started getting immersed in Torah, I was told a few times like, hey, you gotta stay relatable. I mean, you're just talking like Torah all day. You gotta be able to like mingle in and talk about other things. And I was just like, I mean, I don't. Why? Like, what's the purpose? Like the purpose of us is to serve Hashem. I'm sure there's some truth in what I was being told, but it's like David Hamelech is saying, you know, no matter who you're before, you have to speak words of Torah. That is our purpose. The purpose of man is to perfect the soul, to, you know, go through the process of tukuning. It's not to idly sit by. And, you know, it kind of brings me to, I wanted to ask you a question. Like, what do you say to those people who, um, they feel like they're doing, I'm living good. I'm not
Yeah.
hurting nobody. You know, I'm striving for, you know, better myself, better my family. Um, I don't want to keep Shabbat. I don't want to have to, do mitzvot. I don't want to do those things. But why would my reward be any different? Because I'm literally trying to live a good life. I believe in God. I believe that there's a higher power. But why do I gotta keep the mitzvot? Why do I gotta keep the commandments? Like, what do you say to those people?
You got to ask them, how do they? What is the basis of how they know they're living a good life? Where's the rule system that they go to and say, I am living a good life based off of what?
Mm,
Now, if they're saying, okay, I live as a good citizen in America and I
mm,
follow the laws of the country and I don't break any of the laws and I work hard every day and that's it.
mm,
And then again, you have to say, well, who said that that was the purpose of your life? What is the system of life? What's telling you what to do? Like if you're saying you believe in God and God said on the seventh day He rested, why would you not rest? If God says certain foods are pure and impure, why would you go and eat impure animals? Right?
mm,
I mean, I'm just saying, like if you say you have your own understanding of God and you live in your own way, okay, fine. But if you're saying that you're living a good life, quantify that. What makes it? Because you follow American law. There
mm,
was times in America that America said it was okay to like, if a black person was acting out of line in the city, anybody could discipline.
mm,
So I'm saying, so a system that creates rules that thought like this even a little bit. Why is this? Why is this a basis of law?
mm,
But again, I mean, but again, it's that's the uniqueness about the soul of the Israelite, right?
mm,
That's the whole concept, because they have a yearning for these questions. They want to know, and that's the thing, and that's what people have to be sensitive to, is to friends and associates and people close to them that don't have necessarily this yearning. But it doesn't mean they're any less holy, right?
mm,
Or valuable. You know what I mean? But you have to be able to like, really be clear on that. Like not everybody's gonna get it, man. You know what I mean? Not everyone's gonna have a desire, but that's not the point. All throughout the Tanakh, there's people who got it, there's people who didn't get it.
mm,
So you just have to do your point. Now, what you would want is to pray for those people that Hashem gives them a koach, a strength to be able to arouse that desire within them,
mm,
right? But you have to pray for those people. You got to really pray for those people and really get to a conclusion, right? We just have to accept people for where they're at. You know what I mean? And I think that's true love. You know what I mean? I said when you accept somebody for who they are and where they're at, without them having to be more and not being less, and just accepting them for who they are, and seeing the beauty in that, seeing the charm in that, seeing the innocence in that, seeing the strength in that, right?
mm,
And being able to be in that mindset and not be there. I see so many, like even like couples, right? We're not talking about that, but I'm just using it as an example. I'm saying I know a lot of couples where the wife is holding at a way higher level than the husband, or the husband's holding at a way higher level than the wife. You know what I mean?
mm,
It's just the way it is. But that doesn't change anything, because we're together in for holiness, for union, right? The secular world, their whole approach is like creating a situation where it's like, oh, well, we got to match stats, right? That's why a lot of these girls are, oh, I need a man at my level. You know what I mean?
mm,
So it's all about matching stats. But in Torah, in Israel, it's about union, right? And it's just about having someone in your life that you could give love to. And that's the one who's on the same page as you, who does everything. And in fact, God will put an influence in the people around us to not be into it,
mm,
just to further us to build the strength of leadership. That I got to do this alone. I got to build this. I got to change, right? Because everything is just a reflection of me. I am the world, right?
mm,
So God will infuse people to not be into it. So you have to walk alone. It's like a lot of times, like I knew this guy, and I knew him. He became, he converted to Judaism, whatever, the whole thing. But he was telling me, like, when he was going through his process, that his dad was like, like I would say his dad's like a preacher, but they used to like do a lot of like leadership type stuff in their community, type of thing. And so when he started on this journey, he wanted to marry this girl or whatever. And so his dad like really pulled back on him. Like was like, I don't want to be involved. You're learning with these people, these types of things. You should continue on that path. And the more he grew, the more distance his dad became from him. And he said he was telling me once like how he was like resentful of it for a long time. But then he realized that that distance is what allowed him to build that strength,
Mm-hmm.
right? And actually, I tell you a story I even Yehuda Berg told me. So Yehuda was telling me, like this was a long time ago, so many years ago, decades almost. And he said to me once, he told me a story about like how he married his wife, Michal. And he was saying like when he went to marry her, like she was an Israeli girl, don't think, whatever, blah, blah. But the Rav, his father was totally against it, right? And so for him, it was like this big thing. Like, why is the Rav, like, it's not just your dad, it's the Rav, you know? And the Rav's like, no, I don't think it's a good idea, this, blah, 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 the whole thing. And so he said that he went along and married her, right? But he was saying his dad not being there, the Rav not being in the supporter was the greatest gift because he had to make the decision on his own.
Mm-hmm.
If his dad would say, yeah, yeah, she's amazing, she's a day kid, okay, okay, of course, everyone, the Rav loves, but he wouldn't have to own it, that he made this decision. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of times God will infuse the people around us to not be into it. Not because they're not into it, but because God is putting us through a transformational process where where we have to walk alone, right? And we have to build that alone, and we have to build that armor alone. And it's difficult. It's very difficult. I remember when I first finished my conversion process. I remember like I was getting into a lot of arguments with my parents. I was like like challenging. Why are you guys watching so much TV? All this type of stuff. Just like little small stuff, but it was like argumentative.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyways, we went and we like met with like a therapist type person, whatever. My family's really into that. And so we went and we talked it out. And what I came to realize that the issue was really me because I made such a big jump in my life that I was like didn't want to go alone. And so like I was arguing with my parents, but really saying, "Come on, don't I made this big jump. Come with me, mom and dad." Because it was just like I was in this new space, right? And this whole thing, and so now I got to deal with this whole new reality by myself, right? And so, but that was one of the big steps of leadership for me, like learning how to be able to go forward. So it's all good. It's like it's not about convincing anybody. It's about letting the light force of God do it. But the way that we participate in that is by going deeper, because everyone wants the light.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants the light. So if you want the light, you ain't got nothing to worry about. You know what I'm saying? They're gonna follow. You know what I'm saying? It's like that one dude in the family makes some money. Everybody else uniform now. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So this is even a higher level than that, right? So anyway, let's continue on. We have any thoughts or reflections on that?
Um, so another thing what it was bringing out about how you can as you study Torah, it'll bring out the thoughts of teshuva. And it brings out consideration, so you don't have to necessarily go through the pain and sufferings, right? It's like you see somebody else hit their head, you don't have to hit your head. Like in my imagination, it's enough. I saw it. I'm good. I don't need to go through that. So it kind of made me think about how suffering brings out the true nature of man. You don't know who you are. You're gonna find out through suffering where you're holding, where you really are, and the conditions that surround you are by your own decisions. So you create the conditions per se, but Hashem manufactures those, situations to benefit you. Because
Yeah,
if it was only up to us, it would be detrimental to us because we don't know what we're doing at all. You know what I mean?
period.
So Hashem creates it where even though you made these decisions and they're going to bring these consequences, they're going to better you. So the suffering is going to bring out your true nature and give you the opportunity to see who you are. Um, One thing I've kind of noticed is that, and I've been there myself before, is that a lot of times we feel that if these conditions weren't here, I wouldn't act in this way. And it's like, that's so intriguing. Like, what do you mean? But the conditions are here and you are acting this way.
Mm.
So it's like, take that as, it's like a humility thing. It's like a lot, I feel like a lot of times, and I've experienced it myself personally, I've experienced with other people. It's like, oh, if it wasn't like this, I wouldn't be like this. But it's like, how can you have a disconnect in that way? You are like this. Hashem's showing you this is who you are. If everything was rosy, then you don't know. It's like a man says I'm righteous, but he's on the island by himself. You have no idea if you are or not. You're by yourself. You have no temptation. You have no stimulus that actually arouses this integrity that you say you have. So I don't know. It's just something we were just reading that last chapter that made me think about it. And it's like, I think for myself, I definitely want to be a light. I want to help myself first and foremost, but I want to help others. You know what I mean? I want to receive. I want to receive for the sake of giving. And it's just sometimes I get stomped on like, how do you let people know how serious this is? Like you can't afford not to pursue. You choose
Right.
wisely. You know what I mean? Like you have to choose so wisely because you cannot afford it. It seems like you can, but you can't. You can't afford it. Like
Yeah,
this.
but you know what? On that point, it's definitely true. But there's another factor too, is the prayers of the Sadiq, right?
Mm,
And so, you know, in the Sadiq, the level of the Sadiq is based off of the people he's around, the generation. You know what I'm saying? So
mm,
you're not comparing yourself to Rabbi Akiva, right? You compare yourself to the leaders of our generation. And so as you and myself and all of us continue to elevate, we become those righteous people in the community, and they're and they're blessed under our rishus,
mm,
right? And they're elevated because of the light we're bringing down to the learning, to the tefillah. That's what we pray for them. We elevate their prayers, even though their prayers may not have kavana, this, but we're able to elevate them, right?
mm.
So the thing is just the thing is just being able to say, that it's like, yeah, it's definitely people who may not get it, but we're here to elevate them. So anyway, so we're in the Shulchan Aruch, and we're going to do a different part. Right now we're going to do a little part on the brachas around eating, namely around hamotzi. And this will be a three-part series because there's three major chapters around this we're going to go into. All right, so we're starting at Kol She'okilim Beitok Hasuda. So he says like this: everything you eat during a meal to satisfy your hunger, for example, meat, fish, relish, soups, pancakes, etc. Even if you eat them without bread, you do not have to recite a bracha before or after them, because since you're eating them to satisfy your hunger, they are considered part of the meal. He said the whole meal is secondary to the bread, which is the mainstay of life. Therefore, all the foods are exempt from the bracha of hamotzi and bracha of mazon, right? And even it said if the food is sent to you from another house, you do not have to recite a bracha over it because it assumed that you mentioned that you intend when you recite your bracha that included that your bracha included any food that came to your table, right? So he's saying like this. He's saying that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is saying like this: that when a person does hamotzi, right? So you have bread or you have a meal, and you say a bread and you say a bracha of hamotzi, that covers any food that comes on your table, right? And in the blessing of bracha mazon, covers everything that you had on your table in terms of the after blessing. Vekin eno sarig levracha levarek al kol mine mamashkin. Okay. He says similar, you do not have to recite a separate bracha over beverage because the beverage are also considered part of the meal, since it is not usual to eat a meal without drinking. The exception to the rules when you drink wine, because wine is something special. Okay, so he's saying like this. He's going to give us an example, but I want to give him. So he says, so once you have a meal and you say chamotzi, right? So you pull out, say, orange juice or a beer or a shot of whiskey or you know what I mean, anything like this. He says you would there from that point on that you would not have to make, excuse me, a bracha because it'd be considered a meal. I mean, it'd be considered a part of meal like all the other foods. So this also includes beverage. But he's saying when it comes to wine, it's different. So he says, for in many instances, we must recite a bracha over wine, even though we do not actually want to drink any. For example, when reciting kiddush or havdalah. Therefore, you have to recite a bracha over it. And during the course of a meal, you recite a bracha over the wine before washing your hands for the meal. And your intent to drink the wine during the meal, even though without a special intention you are accustomed to drink wine during the meal, you do not have to repeat the bracha for it exempt with the bracha that you said over the wine before the meal. So you talk about Shabbat. He says, so if I'm eating a meal, so say me and you, we went out, right? It's a big thing in Israel is to have wine with lunch, right? It's a very European thing. It's definitely not American. I mean, it's definitely not America. It's definitely not LA, right? Because everyone drives, so you can't be drinking. Yeah. But public transportation, these things, it's such things that everyone. You go to most restaurants, people are going to have a glass of wine with their lunch, and for sure dinner. So he's saying if you have your meal and you say hamotzi, right? So you have bread with your meal, so you go and wash, you come back and you say hamotzi, and then then you start eating, and then they bring some wine, right? So he says you have to say a bracha on the wine because the wine is special, has a unique status. It's hagefen, right? The other bracha is over shakol, right? So this is a very high bracha, and so he says, so he's saying, so he says so he used the example of Shabbat when we make the bracha before, right, the meal, right, when we say kiddush. He says that how we don't have to say the bracha again after we say hamotzi, because the bracha over the meal, the bracha with the kiddush, the person had in mind that this is for the sanctification of Shabbos, and so therefore it's in Shabbos. So by Shabbos, then we don't have to say it again. Now he's saying the same thing also applies in the regular thing. He says if you say a bracha over the wine, then you say hamosa, you don't have to say a bracha over the wine again if you're accustomed to that. So let's do it again. So it says, so he says, if you are accustomed to drink wine during the meal, you do not have to repeat the bracha for it exempt with the bracha you said over the wine before the meal. He said whiskey, which is in our area, Central and Eastern Europe, is not usually accustomed during the meal. It is a question whether it's part of the meal or not. Therefore, if you intend of drinking whiskey during the meal, drink a little bit before washing your hands, unless then the kazayat, the recite like a little shot glass, recite the bracha over it, and have in mind that during the meal, if you fail to do this, recite the bracha on it. He said recite the bracha on a bit of sugar and thus exempt the whiskey. Okay, so he's saying like this. He's saying the whole concept that he's trying to bring out right now is being accustomed, right? Being accustomed to what you normally have and what your intentions are. So he's saying where he's from, people don't really drink whiskey. So then you could argue, if I have whiskey during the meal, do I say a bracha on it or not? If I say hamotzi, why? He's saying because it's not something we normally do. He said you may say after bracha because it's not a part of the meal, right? So that's the point he's trying to make over here. He's saying if it's not, he said whatever. So he said, and he said and he says and there are those who resolve the problem by dipping. So all right. So then he says some people. He gives where listen to this. He gives two different. He said if you fail to do this, you can recite on a bit of sugar, thus exempting. So like say you forget to do this, you can make a bracha on sugar, which will exempt the whiskey and make it, I guess, it a part of the meal. And he says, and he says, and there are those who resolve the problem by dipping some of the bread into the whiskey, but other authorities question this practice. It's like random, it's like little random things like this. He says, "I רוצה לאוכל ביתו הסעודה, פירות לבלו." He says, if you wish to eat fruit during the meal without eating bread with it, since the fruit is not a central part of the meal, therefore, even if the fruit was on the table before you made the hamotzi, nevertheless, the fruit is not exempt with the bracha of hamotzi, and you say the bracha before eating the fruit. So unless you live, I guess, maybe in the tropical places, most places fruit is not necessarily part of every meal, and so it'll be considered something in addition. So you should say a bracha. However, the after bracha over fruit is not necessarily because it will be exempt with the bracha mazon. Oh, interesting. He says if you intend to eat the fruit. So with bracha mazon is interesting. So he's saying right here that if you have fruit during your meal, don't assume that same bracha mazon would basically elevate that fruit. It said if you had intention to eat the fruit with bread, you do not have to say any bracha because the fruit is secondary to the bread. If you intend to eat some fruit with bread and some without bread, be sure to eat the fruit without bread first, and make a bracha over the fruit. Afterwards, you can eat the fruit even with the bread. But if you first eat the fruit with the bread and then eat the fruit without the bread, there's a question about saying the bracha. Okay, so he said to be in like lachatchila being the best place, eat the fruit by itself. Okay, if you eat the fruit with the bread, maybe make a sandwich. I don't know, right? If you eat the fruit with the bread and then you have fruit by itself, then it could be you may not have to say a bracha. But all these things are big discussions, right? This is just kind of like the Shulchan Aruch. It's kind of like giving us an abbreviated, but there's big discussions and there's a lot of ways to perceive it. And so that's part of the Shulchan Aruch study. Right now, we're just going to the general idea, right? So he said, which is the most important, right? Because whatever. So he says, but if you eat the fruit first, okay. So question two: some people are accustomed to eating something between the courses that increase the appetite, such as pickles, olives, pickled lemons, relish, or other relish. These are considered part of the meal. These 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 relishes enable you to eat more. Yeah, so he's saying like dips, this type of thing. So he says, therefore you do not have to recite a bracha. Therefore, eating these relish for the bracha on the bread, the bread is exempt. Because for eating these relishes for the bracha or the bread exempts them. Yeah, the bread. So when you think about dips, other things like little like pickles and this and random like dip stuff, those are all covered on the bracha. And keep in mind too, when we talk about the bracha, we're talking about elevating all the souls inside of those foods, right? We learned about that in Chav HaYashar, that all the different food elements have different sparks of God in them, and on the table of a Jew, it becomes it becomes a mishbeach, it becomes an altar, right? And so as we eat food and we have the consciousness of fulfilling the sacrifice, so we don't have the altar anymore, right? We don't have mishbeach right now, but what we do have is the house of a Jewish home. And so the Jewish home, that table is basically are equivalent in 2025 to the altar where the sacrifices happened, right? And so when we talking about that, we're basically like we're hearing about the halakha, but this is how we elevate the souls, right? Because the whole purpose of Jewish eating is to elevate sparks of God, not just to fill the belly, right? And so we're saying that this is the technology used to create the environment where the soul can go. So they can't give us both concepts right now, right? They have to go step by step. So the step we're dealing with right now is the structure. But if you read others farm, you'll learn what's going on. And now you see them come together. Suuda to alaha perot she ya yo kerema ima hepat. So he says the principal part of your meal consists of fruit with you, intend to eat bread, since the food is the main part of the bread. You know, some people have these fruity type things on, I think it was like Shavuot. Sometimes people have these like dairy fruity type things. So he says exempt from the bracha of hamotzi at the time, because it's like that's the point. They're trying to hold in this idea of what is a meal and then what is a part of a meal. And so the main basis that if you we read that we look at the halacha, what's being said by our sages, they're giving that's the main point they're making right now, right? They're giving us different instances, but the main thing they're showing that there's the idea of being a part of the meal and not being a part of the meal. And if it's a part of the meal, it's covered in the hamotzi. But if it's not a part of the meal, it needs an additional bracha. And so over here, we learned that there's a such thing as fruit meals. So therefore, the fruit would be under them, as we learned before. If you have a regular meal with like fried chicken and steaks, I love fried. I'm just saying, I've been eating so much fried chicken, I think I gained weight back, but I'm okay. I'm getting to it. But the point is just saying that but if we have a regular meal and you bring something that's not characteristic for that meal, that would be an addition. But then there's other times where it would be normalized. He says pero da havil shakilin leisarech ha suuda. So he says if you're going to eat fruit that was cooked for the meal, as usually done with a side dish, whether it was cooked with meat or without meat, you should still eat some of both at the beginning and at the end of the meal with bread. Then during the meal, you can eat even without the bread. And if you do, you do not have to recite a bracha. Ma'aseh yofa. So he says, and if you bake goods such as cakes, whatever, different breads, whatever. He says during the meal to satisfy your hunger, you do not have to say a bracha. You can eat them just as for your enjoyment. There's a question of a bracha is required. Therefore, it's best to have in mind when you say hamotzi to exempt all types of food. So he says even if you add extra food, he says afar gemar. So it says like this. He says if after you finish the meal you you drink coffee in order to digest the food before you recite the bracha hamazon. You have to say a bracha prior to drinking it. Okay, so if after you finish your meal and you have coffee or tea before you say bracha hamazon, he said before you say bracha hamazon, he says before you say bracha, you have to say the bracha prior to drinking it because anything eaten to help digestion is not considered a part of the meal. Nevertheless, it's best to say the bracha of shatol or some sugar that can be exempt with coffee. Okay. Okay. So the main idea is be able to have aware of what is the meal and what is additions to the meal, right? What are my intentions when I'm eating? And what is the flow of the meal, and then what is not the meal. You know what I mean? And being able to be clear on that to say, do I need an additional bracha after hamotzi, or do I not need an additional bracha after hamotzi, right? And what does that mean? But you decide.
Mm.
You decide. That's the power. He's giving, the Shulchan is giving example. but you decide at your table what that means,
Hmm.
right? And that's the power that you have the power in your mind to determine, what is kosher and what's not in terms of within the framework that we just learned.
Hmm.
Hamotzi, okay, that's the framework. Bracha mazon, the after bracha, that's the framework, beginning and end. Now, in the middle, you have to decide what in your is part of the meal and what is something additional. But you have to decide that beforehand,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
if you're going to have certain things that you're going to have as additions, you have certain issues. Well, how to make sure that this thing that's maybe not normal is considered a part of the meal, and how do I make sure I cover it? And they give certain examples of the whiskey with the sugar, these different things. But I mean, you already, I mean, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but it's just saying, but just refining the thought, is more what we're, talking about. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So okay. So what I've been doing, and I'm happy we're having this conversation for sure. So if I have bread,
Yeah,
mostly exempts everything, right?
yeah. The Homosi covers everything. Yeah,
Covers
that you
everything,
intend to have during that meal.
right? So, but so let's say it's Shabbos, and okay, obviously we have mimosi, we're gonna have steak, sweet potatoes, green beans, right? But then throughout the meal, it's like, I would like something sweet. I would like a piece of cake or something. Hamosi exempts that cake,
No,
or
no, the cake will be the cake will
that's
be a mezonot.
uh, okay. Yep. Okay, that makes sense. So even if it was
But it depends because if you normally have cake at the end of your meal,
mm,
it may not be considered an addition.
mm, if
You see
it's
what I'm
if
saying?
it's something that's typically done, but if it's like spur of the moment, like what, there's some in we got some cake, let's eat some. That
Yeah. Or maybe you're celebrating and you don't normally do this, so you're gonna have some
mm,
extra stuff on the table.
mm,
You know what I'm saying? Like you're gonna have gummy bears out, and you're gonna have, some other types of cakes, whatever. But some people to solve the issue, they just do brachot mazon, and then they
mm,
just they just eat afterwards and just do regular brachot.
Mary Brockers for it.
Yeah.
So like okay, if it's not Shabbos, it's just a regular meal. Chicken, macaroni, whatever.
Well, you don't want to have chicken. You don't want to have the meat and
Right,
chicken,
because
the
that's
meat and
the
cheese.
rabbinical with the rabbinical. So yeah, you're right. So let's say let's say salmon, macaroni,
Yeah, yeah. Fish
sweet
first
potatoes, right?
course,
So it's
soup.
shell for the
Meat.
fish, then it's parija dama for the sweet potato, and then water shell.
You say without the hamotzi.
Yeah, without the almost no bread.
Yeah, yeah. So potatoes would be hadama.
Hmm.
The chicken would be shakol.
Hmm.
Um, what was the other things you had?
Uh, Macaroni. That's
Yeah,
well,
you want to be careful about the meat and dairy stuff, on its own, macaroni would be shakol, or actually it'd be mezzo because of noodles.
but the noodles, the cheese are not predominant over the noodles.
Yeah, cheese. Yeah, so I don't know why it's a shakol, but yeah, it'd be a mezzo. But it depends on the noodles how they're made. So it's
Mm.
very specific.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
so you get all those brachas, and
Mm.
you elevate the food. So
Yeah,
you did a whole bunch of mitzvahs just eating.
yeah, I be trying to keep a mitzvah counter. You know what I mean? If it's like a lot of food, so I'll keep it on my phone. Like, all right, you know what I mean? So I can set a broccoli afterwards for each one. Because it is a broccoli for each one. So it's like okay.
No,
So I
it's a
got, all
huge.
right,
No, it's a huge. And we're gonna go. We'll go into more of the mystical meanings of the brachot after. We'll go into it, but it's humongous. One bracha could save a person. It save a whole community. One
mm-hmm.
bracha can bring. Anyways, let me. All right, so let's continue on. We'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to be on the Masechet Brachot and Kaf Yashar, right? So any
Mm-hmm.
thoughts, questions, anything, just hit me up. I'm
Okay.
gonna take this call, but call to Baruch Atah Adonai Leolam Amen Ve'amen.